a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Coffee isn't native to the Americas. I have no idea how the folks living here got out of bed in the morning without the siren's song of the brewing beans calling to them. It took a lot of hanky-panky on the part of the Dutch, followed by the British, to get Juan Valdez and his donkey a job. The folks in South America grow some really good coffee. The folks in Ethiopia grow some good stuff as well. Unless you have your own private jet and want to fly all over the world looking for coffee, you can swing by the Organic Man Coffee Trike Organic Man Coffee Trike 4501 and sample some of the best coffee in the universe. If the city of Laredo is too far for you to go for a cup of joe, you can go to organicmancoffeetrike.shop. Drinking bad coffee leads to bad things. And remember, apart we are together. Who all out there is chasing the frog? Who out there knows what that means? If you do, let me know. I know what it means. Vic Hermanson said something about giving each of those characters on Trailer Trash Terrors their own email address. I can see some problems ahead. The characters will begin bragging about who is the most popular or the least. It seems that most people don't care for Wilbur, the ethereal pest control specialist. Annabelle Lee is going to be confused with Avalon Leon Dickworth Smythe. What a name. They'll get each other's mail and read it and then get mad at each other about it, probably. Or will they just laugh about it? We have to wait and find out. It will be something to follow as these folks, who may only be voices inside our heads, get after each other. Or have they moved on to being tulpas? I usually try to take my listeners through the hour in chronological order. Start at the beginning and end at the end. Tonight, I'm going to start somewhere around the end and wind up way in the past. This might sound like a bad idea to some of you. It does to me. This order of things is how I learned all about who is supposed to have discovered America. In school, they never explained why these two continents were called America. They focused on that old guy, Chris, who was such a bold mariner. He went against all the thinking of Europe to sail west in order to get to the east. We were told everybody believed the earth was flat, as I went over in Flat Earth show a couple of weeks ago. Columbus was some kind of a maverick. He knew more about things than all those folks who got paid to sit around all day thinking. Had this been the case, Chris would have found himself standing, or more likely suspended, before the Inquisitors. If folks thought the earth was actually flat, and Chris said otherwise, this would have been close to heresy. Speaking out against what the church was telling others was highly unrecommended. If everybody knew the earth was flat, yet the king and queen of Spain were willing to risk some of what little fortune they still had on some guy from Italy. They make it sound as if Queen Isabella had the hots for old Chris. And she was convinced, or she did convince her hubby to lend to this crazy man a couple of ships and crewmen and some gold and jewelry so he could go gallivanting over the edge of the planet. Columbus was trying to find a shorter route to India so he could bring back tons of spices and make food taste better. Up until then, everything tasted like the inside of a chimney. Instead of drinking tea, the folks were stuck sipping warm water. Italian food was no different from German food. There was no way of making meat taste like anything other than hot, dead animals. Okay, maybe that's a bit of a stretch, but it does explain why so many people wanted to get to India and back. He who controls the spice controls the universe and all. The king handed over 3 ships. At least that's what they tell us. I've heard a few people say there were actually 2 ships, while others say there were 4. Once Chris and his men landed in America, the King of Spain decided to name the continents after him. That's why we live in North Columbia. Do I have to tell you that that's not right? His image was hung from every wall, and people were naming their kids after him. All those pictures you see of Columbus were painted long after he had departed this planet. No one ever said, "Hey, Chris, seeing as you've discovered America and all, come over and let me paint your portrait." Nope, never happened. Amerigo Vespucci sailed to the New World in 1497. He mapped out most of the coastline of both North and South New World. Nobody knew there were 2 big chunks of land. They all thought it was just one huge landmass. 1519, Portuguese navigator Ferdinand Magellan, who was also working for the Spanish, was also looking for a quick way to India and the Spice Islands. Money was to be made by anybody that could get there and back the quickest. 1520, Magellan sailed into a big body of water and thought that the Spice Islands were just over yon horizon. The ocean was calm as he looked at it, so he named it the Pacific, or Peaceful Ocean. As for the Spice Islands being just over the horizon, they were only about 12,000 miles over that thar horizon. The history books used to say that Magellan was the first to discover the Pacific Ocean. The folks living in China back in the 1500s had been looking at it for a few thousand years. They had already bestowed a name on this huge piece of watery real estate. They called it the Eastern Sea. Vespucci mapped out the coast on the New World, and he took his notes back to Italy in 1498. A German cartographer, Martin Waldseemüller, was working on his map of the known world, and he had that squiggly line on the edge needing a name. Waldseemüller is credited with first using the name America in 1507. He had a large 12-panel map based on traveling accounts of explorers of the New World. Seeing as a lot of the notes he was drawing on were done by Vespucci, the name America was written on the New World. Old Chris was hardly even a footnote in the history books. Yes, he sailed in 1492, but He never landed on the continents, and he was convinced until his dying days that he had landed in India. That's why they call him the West Indies. He was such an important figure in history, he almost disappeared totally, thus there being no paintings of what he actually looks like. If not for a little something called the American Revolution, Columbus might have been forgotten completely. A bunch of disgruntled colonists were sitting around, probably drinking massive quantities of beer, or maybe coffee, and somebody said, "Let's have a revolution. We can claim all that land to our west and put in a railroad. We can make cars and become enormously rich." Maybe that's not what they said, but they did discover that their little idea was just that, a very little idea. Most folks didn't want to break away from England. They were perfectly happy with King George being the man in charge. The revolutionaries were quite unhappy about having to pay taxes. They were having to pay for Britain kicking France's backside, and the king had decreed that the colonists would have to cough up some cash. The tax was a whopping 1.5% of their income. The folks back home in Britain were already paying 5% tax. I just try to imagine how things would have looked if the colonists were shelling out 30% like we do today. Most people were quite happy to remain British citizens. The whole idea was King George had some kind of a legitimate right to rule the colonies. He had seized the land from the French, who had taken it from the Indians. Spain didn't want the northern lands. They only were interested in South America. The revolutionaries didn't want to trade one king for another. They wanted to rule themselves. The phrase we all learned in school, "The British are coming, the British are coming," no, never happened. Everybody in the colonies was a British citizen. Yelling, "The British are coming," is just as good as yelling, "We're coming, we're coming." Paul Revere was yelling, "The regulars are coming," as in the regular army, as opposed to the militia. A search was on to try to find some way of discrediting the king's right to call the colonies his. In 1777, the American poet Philip Freneau described this young country as Columbia. There were others who advocated that the 13 states should adopt the name Columbia instead of the United States of America. Have you ever wondered why our nation's capital is called D.C., as in District of Columbia? King's College was named after George III, but it was renamed Columbia College in 1784. South Carolina announced that Columbia was going to be their state capital in 1786. 1788, the Society of Tammany, also known as the Columbian Order, was founded. Tammany was the legendary Indian chief of the Delaware tribe. Tammany Hall, some of y'all will recognize that name, became the power machine of the Democratic Party in New York City, being headed by William Boss Tweed. He was one nasty object who should have been drugged naked down a gravel road. His saying was, "Vote early and vote often." For most patriots, Columbus was acceptable because A, he wasn't British, and B, he was mistreated by the royals back in the old world. Folks began to hear, just like the colonists, old Chris had been dealt a dirty blow by those back east. In early American textbooks from the 1700s, Columbus was the first chapter. Columbus started American history. Until 1492, there was nothing on this side of the Atlantic except dirt and a few animals. Pictures of Columbus showed him dressed in the same style of clothing as post-revolutionaries. Kids were told all about how brave and intelligent old Chris had been. With time, he became like a rock star. He knew the earth was round while everybody else thought it was flat. He was so smart. Columbia was a female version of Columbus. She came to represent the New World nation. She was created from stories of old Chris. Lady Columbia embodied grace and symbols of ancient democracy. She was often depicted as a goddess, dressed in neoclassic gown and holding a shield and a sword, even though she was supposed to have been an Indian. 1792, the folks in Tammany Hall began encouraging people to celebrate Columbus Day. They used a mixture of old Chris and Indians, who he mostly had mistreated, as a means of getting people to accept him as a national hero. 1892, President Benjamin Harrison issued a proclamation encouraging Americans to celebrate Columbus' discovery and the 4 centuries of American life that he had enabled. Old Chris was described as a Renaissance explorer and the pioneer of progress and enlightenment. Harrison hoped to encourage acceptance of Italian immigrants who had not been welcomed into this country. There were signs up telling Italians to either go home or go somewhere else. Here's a little tidbit that a lot of you might not know on how things happen. When folks came over from Europe, if they were traveling second or third class, they had to present themselves at the immigration office. If they were coming first class, they didn't have to. Money and all. The official would determine their ability to immigrate. Those coming into the country that had to present any paperwork, they had to prove that they were who they said they were. A lot of those coming from Italy didn't have any paperwork. No papers, no documents. This led to immigration officials referring to them as without papers or WAPs. It didn't take long for that name to become a derogatory term, but that's where it came from. The system was so corrupt that finally Washington stepped in and they said that they were going to create a new immigration process. Everybody was taken by a ferry out to Ellis Island, where they would present themselves before federal immigration officials, keep them out of New York City until they'd actually been immigrated. In 1934, President Franklin Roosevelt declared Columbus Day as a federal holiday. In 2021, the United States officially added the name Indigenous Peoples Day after all the uproar about the bad things that Columbus had done. Old Chris went from not even being a footnote in history to our nation's hero, just because a few folks thought it should be that way. This is a pattern repeated many times throughout our history. The Indians living in North America were still waiting on old Chris to arrive. They did meet some folks coming in from the other side of the world. Polynesians made landfall along the west coast 800 years ago. A DNA study shows that these two cultures met and intermixed. There is also DNA evidence of Indians, feather, not dot, traveling to some of the islands of the Pacific. The Knights Templar were officially known as the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. That's way too long of a name. That's why we call them Templars. The Templars were established in 1119 and recognized in the papal bull Omni Datum Optimum in 1139. The order thrived until it was suppressed by Pope Clement V in 1312. They were the founders of international banking. Well, heck, they were the founders of banking. If some royal was traveling to Jerusalem, or anywhere for that matter, they had to take everything along with them. They would take their courtiers and their cooks, and they would take knights to guard them and servants to pick up after them. This would necessitate a huge caravan moving through hostile territory. Any food or lodging would need to be paid for in gold or silver. Wagons would be needed to carry all of those chests full of cash. And this would make the entire parade move very slowly, which made attacking it a very lucrative operation. The Templars set up a system where a royal could hand over their treasure and receive a note in code saying that he was in possession of so much gold and silver, which was locked away in a safe vault in Europe. The royal would be able to travel a lot lighter, and if he was attacked, he might just lose a couple of servants, but that was probably about it. If captured, the royal could arrange for his ransom to be paid by anyone holding his coded note. You've heard of a king's ransom? Well, that's where it comes from. Once arriving in Jerusalem, the royal would hand the note in at a Templar commandery and get his gold and silver back, minus a rental fee on the vault. The charging interest was against the law. It was called usury. Many folks believed the Templars discovered the Americas. Well, at least the part up there in Mahone Bay where Oak Island is. This is supposed to be why old Chris had that what looked like a Templar cross on his sails. He had been told of the great continent to the west. He didn't discover it. He just came over and saw it. In 1307, the Templar fleet vanished without a trace while escaping persecution by French King Philip IV. Many say the fleet set sail with all the Templar treasures. They fled west, crossing the Atlantic, and they hid the masses of gold and silver deep underground in the money pit. When asked how the Templars discovered America, we're told they found out from the Vikings, who actually discovered the place. I'll get to them in a bit. There's a map in China, said to be from the 1418, showing the entire world as we know it today. It showed the North and South American continents as well as Antarctica. In order to have a map of the world, somebody must have sailed out and seen it. A lot of scholars fell all over themselves trying to prove the map was a fake. If it were true, then China would have the right to say they discovered America, unless you do some more digging and go back several more years. Owen Gwynedd, a king of Gwynedd, in the 12th century had 19 children, 6 of whom were illegitimate. He wasn't what you would call monogamous. Mad Dog or Maddock, depending on the translation, was one of the illegitimate kids. He was born in Dalwadlin Castle in Llydir Valley between Betws y Coed and Blanau Feistenog. I know I butchered those words, but it's in Welsh. What can I say? The Welsh are mad at the British for conquering them, and so, in order to get even, they spell everything with way too many letters and in an unpronounceable way. 16 consonants with 2 vowels, or 16 vowels and only 1 consonant. On the death of the king in December 1169, the brothers began to fight amongst themselves as to who was going to rule Gwynedd. Mad Dog 2020, a few of you will get that one. Did you know that Mad Dog is for MD? And MD stands for Mogan David? It's one of their bottom shelf wines. Serve at room temperature or chilled. I guess you could serve it hot if you're sitting on a curb somewhere. Mad Dog Thunderbird. Any of y'all know what Thunderbird was? Mad Dog, although brave and adventurous, wasn't into all that fighting and killing. He just wanted everybody to get along, and it would have been nice to be the king, but not if it involved dying. In 1170, he and his brother Rhaiard sailed from Abercarreg Gwynedd on the coast of Wales. They had 2 ships and crews, intent on finding someplace less battle-prone. They also knew the entire coastline was in the hands of others. The coast of France was also pretty much taken by somebody. This left one direction, west. Whether they already knew the New World or not is up to debate. They did know by sailing west they should find some less inhabited land that they could take as their own. They bumped into a landmass that looked promising, but some of the locals weren't too happy with a bunch of light-skinned people moving in on their turf. Mad Dog and his ships moved south, following the coast. They rounded a peninsula now known as Florida and continued on. I'm going to start calling him Mad Doc. It sounds less hostile and less like a bottle of cheap wine. Prince Madoc spotted an inlet that looked suitable for his intentions of creating his own place. He had found his kingdom. The crew got busy building a settlement. The location has been lost to history, but it may be just east of Mobile Bay, a mile or maybe 100. He voluntold a bunch of his followers to stay there and get busy building his kingdom while he was going to take the ships back to Wales in order to bring some more friends and relatives, excluding his brother, King Dafydd, who he still had some issues with. Prince Madoc returned to Wales with great tales of his adventures, and he persuaded others to return to the New World with him. He recruited carpenters and farmers and blacksmiths, anybody with skills that would be needed in the future. There were quite a few folks who simply wanted to get a new start, get well away from the current rulers of all of Britain. More Welsh people sailed across the Atlantic to join the first colonists. This would have been around 1171 or 1172. Prince Madoc's second arrival in the New World got off to a slightly messed up start. Madoc was unable to locate the people that he'd already left behind. Sounds a lot like the story of Roanoke, Virginia. Well, it wasn't Virginia at the time. I think it was North Carolina. Well, Roanoke Island. Now, the ships sailed up and down trying to find the folks that had been left behind. The people at the new town should have been looking for the arrival of Maddock and their fellow countrymen. A signal fire would have been lit to show the location to land. There was no sign ever found. About 120 Welsh colonists vanished without a trace. I constantly get Roanoke, Virginia confused with the island Roanoke, South Carolina. Gee, I wonder why. Because they're spelled the same. Now, Roanoke, Virginia is nowhere near the coast. Thinking the locals weren't nearly as peaceful as he had first believed, the prince decided to try further inland. They sailed up the Kennesaw River as far as they could, and then they set out on foot. Legend has it they wound up in the Cohutta Mountains, which is a small mountain range at the southern end of the Appalachians. They built a fortification to prevent the locals from doing to them as they believed may have happened to the first group. Fort Mountain takes its name from the remnants of a fortification located on the peak. This ancient 885-foot long zigzagging rock wall was built using stones removed from the summit. It's a lot easier to move big rocks downhill than up. The wall is up to 12 feet thick and 7 feet high. On the uphill side of the wall are pits, cairns, small cylinders, stone rings, and the ruins of a gateway. The story coming from the local tribe is that this was built by men who just showed up one day, about 800 years ago. These men had long, light-colored hair and beards. They dressed in clothing that sounded like they were from Europe. Their language was hard to understand, but eventually the tribe was able to determine that these men had come from Wales. A Delaware Indian legend tells of their migration eastwards from the far west, and their meeting with a race of very tall, light-skinned people that they called the Aligui, until they chased them off with the support of the Iroquois, who were also moving eastward. Early explorers and pioneers found evidence of Welsh influence among the native tribes of America along the Tennessee and the Missouri rivers. In the 18th century, one local tribe was discovered that seemed different to all of the others that had been encountered so far. These folks were called the Mandan. This tribe was described as white men who built forts, towns, permanent villages laid out in streets and squares. They claimed ancestry from Wales, and they spoke a language remarkably similar to Welsh. The Mandan finished from a craft called a coracle, an ancient type of boat that is still found in Wales today. Unlike members of other tribes, these people grew white-haired with age. In addition, in 1799, Governor John Sevier, as in Sevierville, where Dolly Parton is from, wrote a report in which he mentioned the discovery of 6 skeletons wearing brass armor, bearing the Welsh coat of arms. George Catlin, a 19th century painter who spent 8 years living among various Native American tribes, including the Mandan, declared that he had uncovered the descendants of Prince Maddox's expedition. He speculated the Welshmen had lived among the Mandan for generations. They intermarried until the two cultures had become virtually indistinguishable. The tribe of Mandan were virtually wiped out by smallpox epidemic that had been introduced by traders in the 1837s. A lot of people talk about tribes being wiped out like to say that they were decimated. Anytime a hurricane slaps a city unconscious, the weather folks will say they were decimated. I don't think they know what that word means. Do I sound like Inigo Montoya? Back in Roman times, if a military unit was found guilty of cowardice or not fighting hard enough, they might be sentenced to decimation. The soldiers would draw lots. 1 out of 10 would win. Well, actually, they would lose. The losers would be beat to death by their fellow soldiers, the other members of the same unit. They would use staffs, and they would pummel each other over the heads until dead. The unit was reduced by 10%, decimated. Next time some weather person says a town was decimated, just picture all the townsfolk out in the streets beating each other to death. The folks trying to sever all ties to Britain wouldn't have wanted to say that Prince Madoc discovered the Americas, seeing as Wales is a part of Britain. No, Italy and Spain was far better. As I was growing up and discovering a lot of what I was being taught was wrong, I heard about how the Vikings had landed in Newfoundland. There was a TV showing that some archaeologists had found an ancient Viking settlement, and they were in the process of digging it up. Many academicians were positive that this was just an old Indian village. There's no way a bunch of savages from the north of Europe could possibly come across the Atlantic in some sailboats. Old Chris was the one that found the Americas, that moment of glory of his. Everybody in Europe thought the earth was flat, they said. I went into all that 2 weeks ago. Here I go again. I'm going to butcher these names. I don't think I have the time to learn to speak Icelandic. Bjarni Heljalfsson was the son of Herjolfur Bardarson and his wife Thorgerd, who were who were early Norse settlers, better known as Vikings, in Iceland. In the summer of 986 AD, Herjolfsson returned from a trip to Norway. He arrived in Uribaki, Iceland, and learned that his father had sailed away with Eric the Red, heading to Greenland, with intentions of staying there. Troubled by this news, Herjolfsson refused to unload his cargo. He told his crew that he intended to sail to Greenland and winter with his parents, as was his usual practice. His crew agreed to stay with him, and they began the voyage together. Driven off course by storm, Herjolfsson kept sailing until spotting land, which he described as being wooded and hilly. They continued sailing northwards, sighting mountainous land partially covered by snow. Realizing these lands did not fit the description of Greenland, the crew changed course and eventually reached their destination. After reuniting with his father, Herjolfsson decided to retire from his life as a sailor. He lived with his parents for the remainder of their lives, eventually inheriting his father's estate. Scholars generally agree that Herjolfsson sighted Newfoundland, Labrador, and Baffin Island, though some argue that he may have strayed farther south into Maine. 15 years later, about 1000 AD, Leif Erikson bought Herjolfsson's ship and retraced his voyage, coming to a landmass that he named Helluland, which is now known as Baffin Island. He named one part of what he could see Vinland, somewhere around the Gulf of St. Lawrence. This time, the Vikings actually landed and set up camp. The locals didn't seem to mind, and soon there was a small village. The settlement looked kind of like an outpost that was designed to allow sailors to land and fix their longboats. Kind of like a modern day truck stop today. Patch that leak and get a hot meal, sleep out the worst parts of the winter, and then sail south to see what might be found. Archaeologists say this settlement at what is today known as Lance Meadow or Grassland Meadow is the only evidence that Vikings found the New World, almost 500 years before Old Chris and 170 years before Prince Madoc and his followers. There is evidence of Viking trading with the natives. They called the locals the Skarlinjar, probably members of the Algonquin tribe. The Vikings also wrote about the Thule, better known to us as the Inuit. Evidence found at archaeological dig sites include combs, pieces of iron cooking utensils, chisels, chess pieces, and ship's rivets. They've also found carpenter's planes and oak shipping parts. Ship parts, not shipping. A small ivory statue that appears to represent a European was found among the ruins of an Inuit community house. The Kensington rune stone was discovered by Swedish immigrant Olaf Oman in a small town of Solum, 7 miles from Kensington, Minnesota. Oman was clearing land from his newly acquired farm when he pulled up a huge stone encased in the roots of a tree. The stone was covered in ancient writing. Oman took the stone to the university, where the boys in the white lab coats declared it was a fake. They accused Oman of trying to dupe them by inscribing the stone himself. What these learned men of science couldn't explain was how Oman managed to get the tree to grow around the stone, or his sudden knowledge of ancient Norse writings. The stone is reported to have been inscribed in 1362, long after what is known as the traditional Viking Age. This is what the stone translates as reading. 8 Gotlanders and 22 Northmen on this exploration journey from Vineland, far to the west. We had a camp by 2 shelters 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were fishing one day. After we came home, found 10 men red from blood and dead. Ave Maria, save from evil. There are 10 men by the island sea to look after our ship's 14 days' journey from this peninsula or island. By the 12th century, Christianity had become the dominant religion throughout the Viking world. It had replaced the earlier Norse pagan beliefs. The folks in charge are still trying to tell us the Vikings never moved inland from the coast. It was too hard, they said. This is right up there with their trying to tell us that they couldn't possibly have crossed the Atlantic. It was too far. After all, the earth was flat, at least they thought. During the Bronze Age, 3,500 to 1,000 BC, 5,000 copper mines were excavated on the south shore of Lake Superior. Millions of pounds of copper were extracted. Only a fraction of this copper can be accounted for among the artifacts of Indians in the Americas. Somebody must have taken all that copper somewhere. It's not all in a pile in somebody's basement. Smithsonian. There's just too much missing copper. North American copper items were dated between 4,000 and 1,000 BC and are amongst the oldest in the world. There's also evidence of trade routes where copper was sent from the Great Lakes region everywhere across the continent. Ancient people in the Old World worked copper about 3000 BC. It was a soft metal and could be shaped easily, but it was no good for making weapons. If you're into fighting and killing, the copper is kind of lame. The Copper Age in Europe lasted up until about 1700 BC. Ancient Sumer may have been the first civilization to start adding tin to copper to make bronze. Bronze was harder and more durable than copper, which made bronze a better metal for tools and weapons. Now those folks could really do some damage. To make bronze, you need about 10% tin and 90% copper. Heat to a liquid and mix. Tin could be found all over the British Isles, although they weren't called that yet, and southern Europe. Copper was also mined in Europe and the Middle East, but the demand was far exceeding the supply. As empires grew, the need for more copper and tin grew as well. This might have been the first arms race. Many folks today believe the Europeans and the Middle Eastern countries were getting their copper from the New World that hadn't been discovered yet. There's also no reason for the Indians to have mined so much copper. Add to this, there's no huge pile of copper artifacts anywhere in the Americas. Where did it all go? Maybe Europeans were sailing back and forth, trading goods for copper, then taking tons of it back home so they could vanquish all the other countries. Scientists have found American copper all over Europe. There are certain radiological markers that they use to track back to the source. Many countries in the Old World were getting their copper from the Great Lakes region. This has led to a rift amongst the boys in white. Some say the bronze was made using New World copper, but the others say that that was impossible until old Chris discovered this place. The Bronze Age came to an abrupt halt around the 12th century BC. Those copper mines around the Great Lakes were abandoned around the same time. A mere coinkydink? I think not. Back in 1909, there was an article in the Phoenix Gazette stating that professor from the Smithsonian had found a fabulous treasure hidden in the Grand Canyon. Professor S.A. Jordan and explorer G.E. Kincaid were exploring the canyon as a part of their quest for historical artifacts. Articles aren't clear as to whether they were exploring together or they simply wound up working together. They had clomb up and down the canyon after spotting what looked like pictographs painted on the side of one cliff. Professor Jordan saw a cave opening and the pair worked their way up to it. As they drew closer, they could see that this opening looked man-made. It was squared off and it had reinforcing with stacked rocks to maintain the opening. Thinking this was some kind of an ancient Indian construction, they ventured inside. The Havasupai people are an American Indian tribe who have lived in the Grand Canyon for about the last 800 years. Havasu means blue-green mountain, and Pai means people. The Halapai, the people of the tall pines, no, the Hulapai, I'm sorry, have also lived in and around the Grand Canyons for hundreds of years. In the past, the Hulapai were hunter-gatherers inhabiting an expanse of more than 5 million acres, stretching from the Grand Canyon south to the Santa Maria River, and from the Black Mountains east to the San Francisco Peaks. The Navajo, also another tribe who lived in the canyon area. The professor assumed that this cave had been used by one of these tribes, and he was hoping to find some relics to steal and take back to the museum. Let's face it, most of the items on display in museums were taken from Indians without so much as a thank you. If you remove things from European graves, you're a grave robber. If you remove things from an Indian grave, you're an archaeologist. Jordan and Kincaid followed the passage deep inside the canyon wall. They could already taste the joy of successful mission. Professor Jordan thought his colleagues would be impressed, and this would probably lead to a full position on the staff of the Smithsonian. Kincaid was counting the money he was going to receive selling all of these Indian relics. After walking a ways, the pair came into a large room. The walls were filled with urns and vases, all made of sparkling gold. The walls that weren't hidden behind these valuables were covered with writing. Jordan looked at the inscriptions, thinking this would be some kind of ancient Indian writing. What he saw looked more like hieroglyphics from Egypt. He at first just decided the inscriptions only looked like Egyptian. The poor lighting from his torch in the dark and the cold conditions, it must have been playing tricks on him. Jordan and Kincaid ventured further into the tunnel complex. They found a central hub where dozens of tunnels led off in every direction. They also found more evidence that this was not native Indian construction. All the treasures found looked like Egyptian artifacts. There were also mummies, wooden sarcophagi with human remains embalmed inside. Embalming was something Indians never did. Everything they found said this was no Indian grave site, but an Egyptian tomb. Having spent the day looking and realizing it was time to bring in excavation team, they left the tunnel and headed back to where Jordan could contact his bosses. I would love to be able to have listened to that conversation. Phones back then were far from what they are today. Once Jordan had convinced his bosses at the Smithsonian he wasn't suffering from heat stroke, plans were made to remove all of the treasures that he had found. The local newspapers reported 180 trucks had to be loaded with all the bizarre and exciting things discovered in these ancient tunnels. The trucks all drove away en route to Washington and the museum there. Once the trucks were safely unloaded, all the artifacts were squirreled away in some secure vault, never to be seen by the rest of the world. Today, if you call the Smithsonian and ask about the Egyptian treasures removed from the Grand Canyon, they'll tell you that never happened. No, the Egyptians could never have sailed across the Atlantic. It was impossible. They all thought the world was flat, and they would sail off the edge. This is the official stance of the folks in charge. These scientists are trying to convince us that the Egyptians and the Phoenicians, who sailed all over the Mediterranean, could never have made it across the Atlantic Ocean. They didn't believe it, so therefore it was impossible. And why would the folks in charge be so dead set against telling us the truth? Let's think about it a second. Say you're in charge of some government agency and you've been saying that those pesky Indians were just a bunch of savages. They lived in teepees and they hunted for food. But there are lots of examples of Indian constructions all over the Southwest. So you send some men out to have a look at these constructions and make sure that they all go away. This would make it more acceptable to bulldoze our way across the plains and take land away from those savages. Hundreds of sites were destroyed by these so-called archaeologists as a way of making the original inhabitants look less worthy of keeping what they had. Once the deed had been done, no one would ever want to admit to the original intent of the exploration to do away with the history and not to preserve it. A little something called Manifest Destiny, which was invented by John O'Sullivan in 1845. 1872 and 73, American bison were killed by the thousands. They were bison, not buffalo. Buffalo live in Africa. Bison are in the United States. Everybody thinks that the buffalo are the bison are the buffalo because of that song. Those big shaggy creatures you'll still find in a few locations are bison. Ever wonder why they were killed? As if somebody were trying to eradicate them? How about the government had realized that the bison were a vital part of the Indian diet? Kill off the bison, kill off the Indians. This ran hand in hand with all of those blankets contaminated with smallpox and all those tribes being herded onto land not fit to live on. It was all a part of our manifest destiny to take land formerly belonging to others. I can say, as far as I know from my family history, we had nothing to do with it. We never stole anybody else's land. That's why we don't have any land today. As for as for Professor Jordan and Kincaid, the Smithsonian deny any knowledge of both of them. However, if you dig deep enough, you can still find references to the team in the Smithsonian. Nothing historically significant, but it still shows that they did work for the museum despite being denied. History says that they both went to Alaska looking for more ill-gotten gains, and that's the last known destination. The Hopi Indians have a legend that says way back when, a young member of the tribe wandered down an unused trail inside the canyon. At some point along the trail, he found a cave. Inside were hundreds of copper and gold containers. There were statues and carvings showing men dressed in clothing unlike anything found in the area. Metal helmets and shields, swords and spears. There was also an idol that showed a man sitting cross-legged, holding a lily in each hand, kind of like Buddha. It sounds as if this young man had found maybe not the same cave as Jordan and Kincaid, but one similar to it. Having no use for these items, and perhaps believing they were some form of sacred site, the young man left, leaving everything where he had found it. There is still a full front page article from the Phoenix Gazette from April 5th, 1909. It tells the story of the discovery and it lists the artifacts removed and transported to the Smithsonian. The so-called experts will say that this article was just an April Fool's joke. Now ask yourself, was the newspaper lying or was the government? The island of Newfoundland, also known as Terre Neuve in French and Takmukok in Mi'kmaq language, is the world's 16th largest island. Recent archaeological evidence has uncovered human habitation of Newfoundland going back as far as 9,000 years. The maritime archaic people moved in from the far west about 5,000 years ago. As they moved in, the people living there either moved on or were assimilated into their group. The elephant in the room that all these people that discovered America are missing is, where did the Indians come from? They were already living in the Americas when all these other people began discovering the place. A DNA from an ancient skeleton shows all American Indians descended from a single gene pool. Their ancestral roots are in Asia. The bones of a 12 to 18-month-old boy who died in 12,600 years ago in what is now Montana is the only known burial site of a person from the Clovis culture. Clovis is the name of prehistoric people that lived in what is now the United States and northern Mexico between 13,000 and 12,600 years ago. They made a type of a stone spear point that differs from stone tools found anywhere else in the world. The boy had been covered in red ochre, a natural pigment that had been used in burial rituals for centuries. More than 100 tools had been placed atop his body when it was buried. These tools had all been dipped in red ochre as well. There were stone spear points and tools used to make these spear points. People had fashioned rods from elk antlers, a rare material in Montana at that time. The bone tools were 13,000 years old, many years older than the child's parents would have been. The bone rods had been deliberately broken before being placed with the boy's body. This suggests that these ancient tools must have been family heirlooms, and they were broken because the boy was no longer alive. You can't have the boy, you can't have the tools. The DNA is used to show that the Clovis people were ancestors of present-day Indians. More DNA analysis has led the scientists to saying that the Clovis boy is related to the Malta boy from Siberia, who lived 24,000 years ago. So all Indians came from Russia. Okay, the Russians discovered America 13,000 years ago. Those folks crossed from Russia to Alaska over a piece of land that used to connect the two continents. Years later, it sunk beneath the waves where the Bering Sea is today. That's where The Deadliest Catch is filmed. I stopped watching The Deadliest Catch when it became a personality conflict show instead of a job that made me happy to be in a hot location looking for people sneaking into our country. I would much rather be sweating out on a ranch somewhere than freezing on a boat anywhere. The whole idea of the land bridge is just a theory used to explain away all kinds of things that scientists have a hard time figuring out. Things like how did the folks from Russia get to Alaska? How did Bigfoot get to the United States as well? I look at the whole mystery as being just a thing to look into when I have nothing else pressing on my plate. I spent a few hours in a lot of gray matter, reading to come to the conclusion everybody discovered America. Millions of dollars have been spent by folks with an agenda, trying to prove that this group or that group discovered the New World. Should they eventually be found right, what will it benefit anyone? Will our economy suddenly become balanced? Will the price of gas go down? Will we all have to pack our things and move? I can see that some politician is going to decide that we have to hand over vast sums of money to make amends for stealing the place from someone other than the Indians. Politicians just love to give other people our money. That way they get enormous gifts back and then forget to pay taxes on them. Why do you suppose the folks in charge would not want us to know the truth? One big reason is those old codgers running all the universities. Many of them rose to power on other people's work. They manage to appear as if they knew things, which is a shaky perch to sit on. To stay on top anytime any young student comes along with an opposing opinion, the response is quick and nasty. A choice is offered. Change their story to coincide with the codger's outlook, or look elsewhere for a position. Once the student has bowed to the old guard, they become stuck on that slippery slope. Once you start lying, the truth becomes unpalatable. Just look at the folks in Washington. Who discovered America? Does it really matter? I would much rather know who killed Kennedy, or where I put that box of all my mementos. I can be very happy not knowing which group gets to have a national holiday in their name for running into a continent on the far west side of the Atlantic, or the far east side, depending on which side way you're coming from. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you'd like to support the show, the easiest way, since I can't figure out how to make my whatever that thing is called, that account. Anyway, if you want to support the show, simply go to Amazon.com and buy one or two or maybe all four of my books. You can get Laredo Paranormal Research Society, the Fort McIntosh and the Paranormal, Paranormal Laredo, or Paranormal Stories. Remember, books make really good gifts. You can wrap them very easily. If you drop them, they don't break. They don't require batteries. And if the person receiving them decides he doesn't like the gift, he can always rewrap it and give it to someone else. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things. And remember, apart we are all together.
Are you coming to the tree where there's strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.